English translation, 394th contact. Saturday, 9th of July, 2004, 12:28 hours.
There you are, Edward. I knew you would come to your workroom immediately when I called you, dear friend. Be greeted.
And you be warmly welcomed and greeted. What already brings you here, my friend?
It is the matter concerning the index CD which you asked us to clarify. Florina picked up the letter from Stefan here in your workroom as requested and delivered it to Quetzal. He and Zaphanat Paneach then consulted together and came to the conclusion that only the possibility finally recorded in writing by Stefan was acceptable and could be implemented.
And what did the two of them say to Stefan's recommendation to hand over a CD of this kind only to trustworthy Figu persons and Figu groups, and only for private study purposes, as he wrote here?
Quetzal, as well as Zaphanat Paneach, argued that this could be done under certain circumstances within the framework mentioned above, taking into account two important points. Firstly, they both stated that the CD would have to be comprehensively protected with regard to possible changes to its contents, so that no unauthorized manipulation of the CD can take place. Secondly, so the further explanation, the CD would have to be comprehensively protected with regard to any possibility of copying. These are the two facts that should be considered in the relationship you mentioned.
Then it is all set to go to the core group at the next meeting.
That is not all clear yet, Edward, because Quetzal, like Zaphanat Paneach as well as me, came further to the conclusion that point one still has to be discussed with you and then by the whole group.
Why is that?
It is about the kitchen conversations. It is unwise to record the kitchen conversations on a CD in such a wise that they can then be made available to the core group members. In general, the kitchen conversations usually contain very poorly written questions, which means that the answers are also incomplete. All in all, the answers are only short outlines of what is hidden behind everything, because you always have to present everything in condensed form. So it is necessary that the questions and answers are first worked out in detail before they are recorded on a CD as actual teaching material and made available to the core group members. If this is not done in this wise, misunderstandings and new false doctrines will arise. The best example of this is your new book, Fluidal Powers, which you have worked through with great effort from kitchen conversations. As you yourself know, the most serious misunderstandings have arisen during the written records and the kitchen discussions, which now need to be corrected and clarified by you with great effort. Unfortunately, many explanations were misinterpreted, as well as many misinterpretations that resulted from the conversion from Swiss German to written German.
Unfortunately, you are right about that.
Of course. Then it should be clear that the kitchen conversations will have to be worked through by you bit by bit before they are recorded on a CD.
What about the written copies?
They should be treated with care by the core group members. And what you told Florina to ask about a pure keyword index for the contact conversations, as well as for the writings and the books, we found that this good idea should be discussed by the whole group.
Here I was tapping on the first point of Stefan's letter, which talks about a CD version, which contains not only keywords, but also the writings and books in full text, which you reject. But according to your meaning, a pure index would be acceptable, if I understand you correctly.
That is correct. Such a data carrier could also be circulated without hesitation.
Writings and books in full text or partial text, if they are burned and sold on CDs, etc., should then, in my opinion, also be protected against alteration and copying?
I have already explained that.
It was just another confirmation question.
Then I will not keep you any longer because you have to go back to the living room now, because we have to do the correction work together with Bernadette in a short time. I will be back later tonight, 2319 HRs. Here I am again, Edward, my friend. Be greeted again?
Greetings to you and be welcome. It is the second time today that I am happy to see you, Ptah.
I too am pleased, for my mind is now set on talking to you in a purely private manner.
Oh, I thought you might tell me something in the future. Maybe something about the weather, when things will be a little more friendly again, etc. I am also interested in world events. Because as you said recently outside of the official conversation, there will be some unpleasant things happening again in the near future, which are worth mentioning. I would also be interested to hear what you have to say about the fact that super smart scientists claim that humans believe in higher beings, such as a god, etc., by nature, and therefore religiousness is natural, although this is not true, and religiousness and religious belief is a consciousness illness.
Concerning the religiosity of humans as well as their belief in a higher power in the form of a god, etc., this is not natural, but the whole corresponds to the evolutionary striving. In this respect, humankind sought the origin of life early on, and because no teachers were available, higher beings were conceived in the train of ideas and fantasies through whom everything was created. First, the sun and moon, fire and wind, and later idols and objects of all kinds, etc., were elevated to higher powers and worshipped. Then humans appeared who acted as mediators between these higher powers and their fellow humans, and thus gained prestige and power over their followers. In time, the higher powers were personified and the gods were created, which led to polytheism or belief in many gods. It was only after this that monotheism came into being, which in time spread worldwide, giving rise to the monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam, as well as Judaism and its numerous sects. Other religions, such as Buddhism, which in the aforementioned sense knows no God, and Hinduism, which pays homage to countless deities, are not among them. And if it is now erroneously claimed that religion and religious belief are inherent in humans, then this is not true, because in principle, religion and belief are two factors that can be inherited from generation to generation, because the genes are influenced and programmed. This results in a predisposition with regard to a congenital inheritance, which automatically comes to a breakthrough when a person of this kind with an inherited predisposition is confronted with a religion and religious belief. Basically, religiosity and thus religious faith, as well as humans praying to an imaginary god or saints, etc., is a disease of consciousness which is just as inheritable as any other genetically determined disease of consciousness.
Consciousness sickness, which even today, in the more enlightened times, is still erroneously called mental illness, because the superminded of this world simply do not want to understand that the human spirit is purely creational and therefore absolutely immune against any attack and any illness. In their narrow-mindedness, they simply do not want to understand that it is only material consciousness that can decay from attacks and diseases. And what you say about praying to a deity or to saints, etc., is in accordance with reality, because prayers are only useful if they are directed to one's own consciousness, thereby promoting conscious evolutionary processes. Praying for the health or welfare of other humans, etc., is not only senseless but also useless when God or saints are to bring about health or welfare. Prayers are always only useful if they are directed at one's own person or consciousness, in relation to one's own life-encompassing overall concept, which also includes health and well-being, as well as the evolutionary development of consciousness, logic, love, knowledge and wisdom, inner peace, inner freedom and harmony in all virtues, etc. and by directing prayer to one's own consciousness, it is able to develop according to all the values mentioned, whereby the person consciously becomes a true human being. In earlier times, the term spirit was used for this purpose, but basically it meant consciousness. This was because humans then only knew the term spirit, but not the term consciousness, which is the case today. It is not surprising that since ancient times religions have been considered the opium of the people, when one knows that religious faith itself is a narcotic drug that creates delusions, false hopes and expectations, illusions, confusion and aberrations, which those who preach religions rely on. Through the narcotic effect of faith, the soul catchers are able to keep their believers in line, lead them astray from the truth, make them dependent on religions, and exploit them many times over. But with what I have said, I do not want to take away the faith from those humans for whom it is the only support in life. My motto is that every believer must become blissful with his or her own faith, just as every person who knows the truth must find their own way with it. But now, Ptah, I will no longer hold you back from responding to your foresight.
What you say corresponds to what is real. As I promised, I want to tell you about some predictions today. Of course, it could be now if you are interested. This time, the predictions refer to a longer period than just 1 week. First, I would like to point out that terror is increasing on a massive scale in Iraq, with hundreds of deaths. The terror is two-sided, with the terrorists themselves on the one hand and the occupying forces on the other. But also in Israel and Palestine, the terror will break out anew, whereby the murderous machinations will also come from both sides. In addition, terrorist acts are also being committed in various other states, such as Turkey, for example, but they are of a different nature from those in Iraq and are also becoming increasingly widespread. Also in England, respectively. In London, the terror continues, because on the 21st of July, a second fourfold bomb attack will take place, whereby, contrary to the previous one, no human lives, but only material damage will be lamented. A further attack shortly thereafter will fail. However, an innocent man will be shot dead by the police during search operations for the perpetrators. This killing will be an execution killing, because the victim, in fear and cowardice of the police officers, will literally be executed with several shots to the head when he is already lying defenseless on the ground. On the 23rd of July, an earthquake measuring 6.1 on the Richter scale shook Japan's capital, Tokyo, while on the same day in Turkey, in Istanbul, bomb attacks caused fear and terror. Then keep listening to what the weather has to say. On the one hand, the weather in Europe continues as before, which means that in various parts of Europe there is great aridness and severe drought, leading to large forest fires and serious crop failures, while in other parts torrential rainfall leads to very large floods and landslides as far as southeastern Europe, but elsewhere the weather is again moderate and fine. Many humans will lose their lives as a result of the floods as well as the aridness, droughts, and forest fires. Some summery weather can be expected again next week in Switzerland, after which rain and sunshine will alternate, and very severe storms with large hailstorms will destroy many things, which will also spread to other parts of Europe. The hailstorms will cause very large crop damage. To the thunderstorms and droughts it is to be said, therefore, that this does not only apply to Europe, but also to other countries, as for example to the American and Australian continent, whereby, however, also Asia, especially China, and Africa are not spared, because worldwide the thunderstorms as well as the droughts and violent storms, etc., are getting more and more prevalent, also in their violence and their effects, and this against all stupid assertions of earthly scientists who trivialize the whole thing as completely natural. In fact, the whole earthly climate is changing more and more to the disadvantage. It will also be the case in the coming days and weeks, as it happens every year, that violent hurricanes will form in the southern Atlantic and the Caribbean, causing immense damage both to various islands off the southern coast of the USA and to America itself, as well as to the Yucatan Peninsula. The same is true of southern and southeastern and Pacific states in Eastern Asia, such as Taiwan and China, which will suffer great destruction and numerous deaths as a result of violent hurricanes forming in the Pacific. Further, it is to be said that the very stupid claims of irresponsible scientists and know-it-alls that the solar irradiation is as ever in the same strength and not in increased form are not true. These false assertions lead to the fact that the inexperienced rely on it and lull themselves to safety, thus exposing themselves with their bodies unprotected to the dangerous solar radiation, which often results in the fact that both the black skin cancer claims more and more victims as well as the white skin cancer, which is practically never mentioned.
But I do not think white skin cancer is as dangerous as black skin cancer, right?
That is correct.
Is there anything else worth mentioning for next week?
If one refrains from the everyday things, there is only to mention that on the 12th of July, Prince Albert Grimaldi is elevated to the status of the Prince of Monaco.
Then I would like to ask you this, but it is not supposed to be official.
The answer should of course be unofficial because it would not be good if these facts were openly known. And indeed I am aware of these future events, to which I can give the following explanation. Those are the key facts. But now, my friend, I am thirsty. If you will please get me a glass of cool water.
Of course. Besides, it is about time to check if the night watch has started anyway. It will not be long, so here I am again. Here is a glass of water, please. Günther is over there on the first night watch.
Thanks.
Then something else. Radical, fundamentalist Islamic fanatics carry out their jihadism because they want to carry out a world revolution. I have written the following articles on this, which I intend to include in one of my next special bulletins. If you want to read them?
Of course.
Ta reads the article.
Again and again.
Again and again I am asked by telephone, in writing, by fax or email about the state of affairs when any events are causing turmoil and fear to people around the world. This was also the case with the bomb attacks in London on the 7th of July 2005, because I received fearful inquiries from England, Canada, the USA, Germany, Austria, Italy, the Czech Republic, Japan, and Switzerland. Many of the questions I have received relate to the question of whether all possessions should be sold and whether emigration to some other safe country would be beneficial. I can only say the following. Today, no country is safe from international terrorism. Although it should be noted that the USA and countries that have pacts or friendly relations with the USA are particularly vulnerable to international terrorism. It is not only militant Islamic terror fanatics who are spreading death and destruction worldwide, but also various other elements who are at war with U.S. America for whatever reason. Worldwide terror is also spread by the USA itself, both with its military, which rages in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. The U.S. Secret Services and mercenaries are also involved in global terror, as well as everything connected with inhuman penal camps and the death penalty. See Bulletin Number 53, September 2005, article, "The USA Should Clean Up Its Mess on Its Own Doorstep." International terrorism or individual sick, disturbed, or fanatical loners or anarchist groups, etc., are particularly dangerous. The most vulnerable areas are urban centers, especially large cities, airports, railway stations, shopping centers, and means of mass passenger transport such as railways, underground railways, buses, and trams. Also endangered are large crowds of humans in buildings in which many humans tend to be present, as well as power generation plants, power transmission lines, the water supply in certain companies and corporations, etc. Where terrorism does not bring much success, there are places in the countryside where there are no large gatherings of people and where there are no real urban centers. If, however, as is the case with the USA, countries are attacked criminally and warlike in death, destruction, torture, murder, and extermination, and thus practically legalized terror is carried out and spread, then there is no greater security in the countryside.
Aura of terror and Yankee go home.
Although climate change, famine, storms and drought, as well as family tragedies, forest fires, and various forms of crime make the headlines in the newspapers every day, international terrorism is increasingly dominating world affairs. However, this terrorism does not only emanate from actual terrorist cells or terrorist networks, but also from powerful states and their leaders, who use it to carry out their terror by conducting military campaigns, interfering in foreign countries, invading and occupying foreign states, and spreading death, murder, destruction, and ruin. At the forefront of this is the United States, which, as a result of its world policing, intelligence and military terror, has bred and continues to breed enormous hatred of the United States throughout the world, thereby literally bringing international terrorism to the surface. And ever since that hatred against the United States, its friends and allies, has been violently unleashed by U.S. action, terrorists have been striking whenever and wherever they want, whether killing innocent people, women, children, and men. Like the United States, the terrorists are sowing fear, chaos, and terror throughout the world, whereby the innocents are the victims. Mistakenly, the majority of humans believe that the U.S. is fighting international terrorism. But the truth is that the game of counterterrorism is only a game that allows the U.S. to spread more and more across the world and bring state after state under its control. And on top of that, all those stupid state powers and citizens of different countries are aiding and abetting it by profiling themselves as pro-U.S. criers and shouters, supporting the crime-ridden U.S. terrorist machinations. However, this has resulted in the fact that nowadays in public places, in urban centers, in cities, in railways and trams, in airplanes and buses, in ships, as well as in department stores and in certain buildings or in crowds of people, etc., no one is safe in his or her life. Terrorists of all kinds strike unhesitatingly and consciencelessly and spread an aura of terror as death messengers of an irrepressible hatred of U.S. America and all those who are in friendship with the USA, do business with them, or make military and secret service pacts, etc. Many humans mistakenly believe that international terrorism can be fought by counterterrorism in the form of military and intelligence operations and effective warfare, but this is a fallacy that will cost many more lives. The truth is that international terrorism, which is based on unbridled hatred of America, can only be contained and brought to a halt if the world finally turns its back on the USA, and the USA, with all its military, intelligence, and economic forces and so on, withdraws to its own country. It is wrong to assume, or to live in the false hope of assuming, that the terrorist perpetrators of violence could be put on the defensive, because as long as U.S. America itself is spreading terror throughout the world through its military, its secret services, its politics and economy, etc., the international and other terrorists who are hostile to America will continue to wave their sharpened and blood-soaked swords, spreading death and destruction. There are no effective deadly weapons against international terrorism, and no military and intelligence strategies by which it could be fought. The only weapon and strategy that promises to be effective is for the USA to disappear from the face of all the non-American states on the earth, with the military and secret services and the economic guzzlers of the USA retreating to their own country in order to finally establish a humane and just order in their own country. If this does not happen, and if U.S. America does not finally end its own international terror in the foreseeable future, then further and even worse attacks by the USA, as well as by other countries hostile to America and by international terrorism will occur, with the danger of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons with very devastating effects being used more and more. And it is only a matter of time before NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical weapons are used, and that insanely between other states, because what the USA was able to launch in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which was a crime against humanity, other madmen can do as well. It is therefore urgently necessary that real peace should at last be established throughout the world so that such a disaster can be prevented. For this purpose, however, it is necessary that the terrorist and warmongering USA be put in their place and back in their own country, exactly according to the time-honored and worldwide demanding cry, "Yankee, go home." Already, the international as well as U.S. and international terrorism have each developed into mega-terrorism, with terrorist tactics becoming increasingly sophisticated on both sides. An inevitable consequence, because both parties are constantly looking for new ways to make terrorism as effective as possible. Furthermore, both the USA and the international terrorists want to increase the pressure on the affected populations with their changed tactics. With this pressure and the terror associated with it, the USA wants to force the populations to force their governments to be America-friendly and to cooperate with U.S. America. On the other hand, the terrorists also want to use their assassinations and terrorist attacks in the same wise to try to get the people to force their governments to meet the demands of the terrorists, which are mainly based on the same level of hatred towards the USA, and to drive all U.S. forces of any kind out of the countries of the world. Of course, various terrorists also have other motives than just hatred of the USA, because certain Christian, Jewish, Hindu and Islamic religious fanatics regard the open and liberal as well as critical practice of religion and religious customs, etc. as weakness and are thus a thorn in the eye of these kinds of terrorists. There are also individual or group terrorists who do not get along with the authorities or the politics of their own country and consequently carry out terrorist attacks. In many cases, however, all the facts are coupled, as is the case with international terrorism, which gets very badly out of control into particularly dangerous forms, as is especially the case with the militant and fanatical, radical and fundamentalist Islamic terrorists, who interpret everything that does not suit them religiously, cultically, economically, ritually, morally, and so on, as a weakness of Western culture, but especially of Christianity and Judaism. These conservative and fundamentalist fanatics see all development and all human as well as economic, medical, cultural and knowledge-based as well as liberal, equal and educational progress, etc. as cultural decline with typical degeneracy in habits and demands of life, as well as with regard to religion and its rites and cults, etc. They see a decline and a degeneracy of the bourgeoisie, but above all a dwindling of their own power. If they had to grant equal rights to the female sex, for example, or because they fear that through rationality and understanding they would lose their radical fanaticism, that they would have to face real and truthful life and turn to knowledge and wisdom with its true love, inner and outer freedom, as well as complete harmony and real peace. And it is a fact that these terrorists, just like the USA, kill their own people and innumerable innocent ones without hesitation if they believe that they can achieve their goals and enforce themselves to make a profit and succeed. A further factor of international terrorism is to be found in the Islamic jihadism of radical, fanatical, and irrational conservative fundamentalists who strive for an Islamic world revolution, and in this form dominate all international terrorism. On the one hand, there are many hateful and vengeful racial haters to blame, such as the members and supporters of the Ku Klux Klan in the USA and the neo-Nazis in Europe, as well as all those certain ones of low intelligentum and dim-witted ones in the USA and Europe who incessantly seek blame and demonize the Muslim women and men. On the other hand, however, there are also primitive and brain-damaged, sick, super fanatic and Islamic ideologues who are addicted to radicalism, murder and destruction, and who want to hold the West generally responsible for all and every evil in the world, but especially in Islamic states, and to punish, exterminate, and Islamize it. But also all those U.S. Americans and Europeans are to blame who in Western countries exclude and discriminate against Muslim women and men, and who stifle any equality and equal rights for them. This is total fodder for the jihad Islamists who have nothing to do with those decent and good Muslim women and men who live in decency and honor all over the world, who do their daily work, who are good citizens, including migrants in the West, and who want to live in peace, love, harmony, and freedom. Billy.
The articles are good, very good even. You really should publish them.
Can you say anything else about these things?
I can do that. Apart from what you have written here, it has to be said that behind the violence of Islamic extremists, there are other backgrounds that need to be mentioned. However, the boundaries of individual terrorist acts are becoming increasingly blurred because different groups represent different interests in relation to terror. For example, although the objectives of the various terrorist groups are different, as is the nature of the terrorists' activities, which range from suicide bombings and bombings to kidnapping, torture, and the murder of hostages, etc., the means of carrying out terrorism are practically the same. All this in relation to the actual terrorist groups, which fall within the scope of radical, extreme fundamentalist and fanatical Islamists, Christians, Jews, and Hindus, as well as their sects. The military and Secret Service terrorism that the USA and Israel, for example, carry out is of a different nature, but is nevertheless equally criminal and contemptuous of life, because this terrorism also knows no law and no mercy. But let us return to simple and organized terrorism, which is not built and exercised by the state and is not sanctioned by it, just like military and Secret Service terrorism. So now I speak in the main part of the armed and organized struggle of the radical fundamentalist and extreme fanatical Islamists, who practice jihadism in different variations and differ fundamentally from each other in terms of their enemy image, which they fight with all means. If all the non-Islamic, neo-Nazi, extreme, anarchist, sectarian Christian and Hindu, military and Secret Service terrorism of Israel and Western states, especially the USA, is disregarded, then only the radical fundamentalist Islamic fanatics will remain. And of these there are many different groups, but their three main divisions stand out. In the first place, among the terrorist organizations is the one that is directed against the global enemy, which is called the USA. Connected with this is also terrorism, which is directed against all helpers and accomplices and friends who make a pact with the USA in any form, as you yourself have written. This is not surprising, because the hateful game of being world police and the infiltration of foreign states mostly Islamic ones, as well as the interference in foreign states' affairs around the world, if I may use your words, is not accepted and not tolerated, especially by radical, fundamentalist, and fanatical Islamists. Terror in any form is the inevitable consequence, whereby the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, founded in 1998, is the most ramified terrorist network worldwide. It is a fact that countless autonomous groups also participate in this terrorist group, which benefit from the support of Al-Qaeda. However, they are not organizationally linked to the large terrorist network, but have taken over many of its operations and modes of operation. The characteristic actors in each individual case are the so-called fighters, the mujahid. In the terrorist network Al-Qaeda, there are fighters with special technical skills who have been educated and trained for the terrorist acts. While in the autonomous groups, it is characteristic that the actors are generally not trained. Suicide bombings are perpetrated as a militant form of struggle, with the zeal for the cause and motivation, suggested by radical fundamentalist fanatics, being solely significant. The unscrupulous, fanatical suggestion begins already with the children, the younger the better, because when hatred is already bred in the children and paradise is promised, then new radical and fundamentalist fanatics are replenished. It is also not uncommon that human beings, even adolescent children and young ones who are naive, unstable or not quite normal in terms of their consciousness, are packed with explosive bombs and sent to their deaths as involuntary suicides. If we now look at the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, we can see that two kinds of enemies come into consideration, and indeed such who are far away and others who are close by. The distant enemies are those that are seen globally and are also fought in other countries, while the close enemies are local and have to suffer the acts of terrorism there. And unlike other terrorist groups, the principle that distinguishes Al-Qaeda is that suggestive calls are made for all Muslim women and men to work together. Suggestively, it is taught, preached, and influenced in a hateful wise that the Islamic world must be preserved from all Western, Christian and Jewish influences, as well as that all Muslim women and men, and thus all Islamic peoples in general, should enter into wars against foreigners, whereby this does not only mean the foreign aggressors who invade Islamic countries such as the USA and its allies, but all foreigners. The main reason for the new international terrorism was provided by the USA, namely by the morbidly stupid invocation of war on terror and the invasion of the U.S. military and the U.S. Secret Services in Afghanistan and Iraq. This in particular has led to Al-Qaeda becoming a transformed terrorist network, made up of many different groups, individuals, organizations, and individuals of all kinds, making the whole thing practically confusing, dangerous, and unpredictable. Thus, the USA and all its supporters and pacemakers are to blame for the fact that the radical, extreme, fundamentalist, and fanatical Islamist groups worldwide have become increasingly hateful towards Western countries and especially towards U.S. America. Thus, the USA, through its megalomaniacal and criminal actions, has led the radical Islamist groups, as well as individual actors worldwide, to build up international terrorism, and to fight against the USA and its allies as murderously as against Christians and foreigners in general. This includes Israel, which, just like the USA, is fighting Islam and the Muslim population. Through the fault of U.S. America and all its allies and other supporters, especially Great Britain, a new world view of violence and hatred has developed and established itself. This world view has become an evil vision of radical, sectarian lunatics, shaped by the USA and adopted by crazy, radical, fundamentalist, and fanatical Islamists who have no real connection with the Islamic faith and the ordinary Muslim population around the world. U.S. America is accused of being responsible for the fact that al-Qaeda terrorism leads a fight against both near and far enemies, which means that operations are carried out through the terrorist network, which are directed against the USA and its allies and friends, as well as against Arab regimes and, in general, against Western countries as well as Muslim states which incorporate Western ideas and cultural things, etc., or are pro-American. These things have become the #1 enemy image for radical, extreme, fundamentalist and fanatical Islamists, as a result of which those of different faiths all over the world and even Muslim women, Muslim men, and children are indiscriminately murdered by terrorist acts of any form. Another form of terrorism is to consider and combat one's own regime or government as an enemy of the state. And religion, when the view or presumption prevails that their religiosity does not correspond to what fundamentalism and conservatism demand. It goes without saying that the terrorist struggle is not directed solely against the regime or the government, because the assassins and terrorists do not get close to the regime's powers, and consequently they sow death among the innocent population. Another major form of terrorism is the use of all lethal means to try to rid the country of military and Secret Service occupiers and economic infiltrators. Terrorist acts of liberation also take place when non-Muslim rulers are at the helm of an Islamic state, because these are vehemently combated by terrorist activities, whereby the number of deaths among the population is just as unimportant as whether the victims are innocent children, women, and men, as is usual with any form of terrorism. That is what I wanted to have said.
Thank you for your statement. Maybe I can use your words for a bulletin later. Is there anything else to report for next week, or can we turn to the private conversation now, as you requested?
No, I have no further predictions to make. I will explain further when the time is right again.
Good.